Good morning.
Morning.
Okay. How many of y'all remember the first class that you had in college? Just curious. I remember. I remember my first class. It was one of the reasons I remember is because it was just at a ridiculous hour. It was at 7:30 in the morning. I mean, I thought that was just incredibly early, and I thought 8 was the limit of how early you could have a class. But this one was at 7:30. It was a class in New Testament survey, so I was incredibly excited about it too. And the teacher shocked me by mentioning the fact that he had been to the gym already at that point in the day, which I thought was crazy too. I thought, who gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning, you know? And thinking 7:30 was so early at this point. And anyway, it was Mark Hooper. That was his name. He was a missions teacher and he's done a lot of work in Southeast Asia. But I remember taking that class and learning about all kinds of concepts. I remember the first time he said the word synoptic, and it just went right over my head, and I didn't know what he was talking about. I still don't know what he was talking about. But anyway, it was very interesting as I think about that, and so there are a lot of different things that that people have that we keep in our minds, and sometimes there are things like that memory of that first class. The first time we went to the class. There's also a lot of things that happen in our life that we want to stay in our memory, and we know that they won't stay there. Does that make sense? You would like to remember this. This is pivotal. This is important. And so I was thinking about it, and there are many different items that I've located throughout my office that end up becoming these stones of remembrance. And so they help me remember things that I consider to be important to me or still consider to be important. The ones that I can still remember without the stone, obviously have made a larger impact. And so in order to help us understand this topic today, I've brought a few stones. This is called an object lesson. If you ever, for ministry purposes, use object lessons. This stone right here, I don't know anything about stones. Not. I don't know what this is. Okay, so I can't tell you. I know what it means to me. This is a stone that comes from Lycaeum, which is the port city of Corinth. And one of the reasons that I picked the stone up at the beach there wasn't much sand. It was stones on the beach, and was because this was. I just remember looking out over the water, and you could see off in the horizon, just the water, up to as far as you could see. And then you turn around and you can see the remains of the city of Corinth. And then behind it you can see the Acrocorinth, which is this huge mountain just sticking up, out above the land. And on the top of it are the remains of a temple site. And then I remember also thinking, if you were to go another 9 kilometers, which is 6 miles or so, you could go to the other side of the isthmus there, and you could go to Cenchreae, which was the port city that we know that Paul sailed out of, that's talked about in the book of Acts. But what's so interesting to me about this port city is this is the port that's only about half a mile from Corinth, and it's the one that Paul wants to sail out of. What do you mean? Paul was always longing to go further to the west. It was always his desire to go to Rome. And that's what he writes about when he writes to the Romans. He'd never been there yet when he wrote that letter. And I just remember it really stuck out in my mind as I was standing there looking out over the port, looking out into the water, realizing, you know what? Paul probably stood very close to where I am right now and longed to sail from here and head on across to Rome. And I just remember that really it meant something to me. So, picked up a stone. I have another, this is not actually a stone, this is a potsherd. This potsherd actually comes from close to here. It's from just outside of Savannah, Tennessee. It comes from an Indian mound that may or may not be there now. Why? Because every time there's a large rain that comes, more and more this Indian mound goes downstream. So, I'm presenting a moral dilemma to you right now. I have a potsherd in my possession that if I did not have it, it would be lost to the river. You see what I'm saying? And so, why do I have this potsherd? Well, one of the reasons I have that moral dilemma is totally separate, by the way. We can all deal with that, in a different discussion. Why do I have this? Well, first of all, it was gifted to me. Somebody gave it to me. And on top of that, it dates to some Indians who are believed to have been walking around in that part of Tennessee, or very close to here, about 2,000 years ago, more or less, 100 to 300 A.D. And so this potsherd sort of reminds me of where I'm from. It also reminds me, and I just think it's the coolest thing to think about the Indians who are here walking around the same time we're all talking about Jesus walking around Palestine. And that's just a fascinating thought to me, to think about the people who once lived here. This is about where I'm from. This stone right here, or rock, I guess we could call it, but I'm trying to be biblical, stones of remembrance here. This stone right here was important to me for a couple of reasons. In particular, this one comes from the Philippines. It comes from the island of Leyte. And it comes from a town, or a former town, depending on how you look at it, close to St. Bernard. And the reason I have this stone is I was in the Philippines, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago, and we were doing an evangelism campaign around the island of Leyte. And earlier that day, we had already stopped at the port where General MacArthur had landed when he came back to the Philippines, during the midst of World War II. And there's a monument there, and we're just relishing the relationship between Americans and Filipinos, and which is very much alive to the present. But we're really on our way to this particular town because it was amazing some of the events that had happened in this little town. A lot of times you don't really weigh the impact of the decisions that you make. For instance, I never realized that what it means to cut trees down. This was one of those moments where you're like, wow, I can't believe that what cutting down trees can lead to. What are you talking about, Jeremy? Well, in the Philippines, they need wood just like we need wood, and so they go and they'll cut down trees. Well, if you cut down trees in the Philippines is nothing but a series of islands, and they're basically just mountains sticking up out of the water. And so they'll go into these whole sections and just clear cut the land in order to get the wood. Well, because these are mountainous regions and there's a lot of rain there, if you clear cut too much and then you have heavy rain, it creates massive landslides. So in this particular town, this had happened. This landslide just came, the mountain just fell. And it completely wiped a town off the map. 4,000 people, instantly just gone. And one day, they're no more. And I remember driving up to this site where the landslide was, and you could see it for just massive distances away. It was basically this huge rock pile that just went all the way down, for miles. It just stretched for miles from where it had come down and continued to coast. So we came in from the side, and I remember we pulled our car all the way up on a road where the road just suddenly just ends because there's rocks. This huge mountain of rocks there, and we got out and we started walking around, and I picked up one of these rocks. And then, interestingly enough, there was a man who was standing there, and he sort of had a makeshift tent put together, and he lived right next to the landslide. He actually used to live where the rocks were now, and so we started talking to him, and it turns out that he had lost his entire family. And he was standing there, and it was devastating. It was a devastating experience to just try to comprehend this. And of course, everybody was given all kinds of reasons why they thought this landslide had happened here and why it had wiped these people away. And one of the things that stuck up in my mind was one of the guys that I was standing with who's been on this campus, June Arcelia. He was here, I guess that was just last semester. June starts this conversation with a man, trying to explain to the man to reinforce him as a human being. This man has no desire to live any longer. And so all of a sudden we're basically in the midst of this serious conversation about God with this man who was just there on the side of the road when we pulled over. Well, long story short, there's now a church in the regrouping of that village. A congregation has been established there, and I've been fortunate enough to have a very small role in helping that to happen. But there's a congregation of some 35, 40 people there now, and so I don't know why everything happened there like it did, but what do I do know in this situation? I do know the role that we can play. We can respond. We don't have all the answers sometimes of why it specifically happened this way here, but we do know what we can do coming into that situation. This stone helps me remember that. And last but not least, this is a stone of remembrance. What time is it? Anybody know what time?
You get 10 minutes.
15 to.
Okay. You don't get this stone today. That's for another day. I don't have enough time. That's not actually a stone either, so that's wood. But so when I put all of these things together and I start thinking about events that I've been through, it helps me give meaning to my life, and it also begins to demonstrate to me how different factors all weave together in ways that you didn't really plan on or expect. And you don't realize sometimes how interconnected everything is. Everything that impacts your life, your events that are going on here, it ends up having profound impact on events that happen later in your life. Let's take a pause from those thoughts and turn to Matthew for just a minute. Matthew chapter 10. And in particular in Matthew, what I'm wanting us to look at is, first of all, the limited commission and then the great commission. In Matthew chapter 10, and we could spend a lot more time unpacking this because it's just beautiful the way this gospel structures these things. You look down in verse 5, after he selected the 12 apostles, it says, "These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You receive without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or a staff. For laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town." One of the reasons this passage is important to our topic today is, if you noticed, who is this message to be proclaimed to? Who's supposed to get the message in this passage? You can answer.
The Jews.
The Jews. Specifically, what does it say?
Go not to the Samaritans or the Gentiles, go to the children of Israel.
The house of Israel. And don't go to these other ones. God is thoroughly, Jesus that is, God is thoroughly making sure that His message goes to this particular group of people. And that's sort of what we have the limited commission for. Taking care of the details. Now let's go over to Matthew chapter 28. After all of these events happen in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus carries out this limited commission to Israel and appears to have not succeeded. You can read Matthew chapter 13 when it's given the explanation of parables, and he's quoting Isaiah, hearing they're not going to hear, seeing they're not going to see, basically saying we're going to go, but it's not going to work. And in fact, if you unfold the rest of the gospel, they crucify him, leaving Christ with the conclusion of Matthew 28, verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee. Remember, Judas is not there with them, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Here we have the Great Commission. Great in the sense of a greater area. It's supposed to engulf all the nations, all those who are outside of Israel. So we had Israel first, and then everyone outside of Israel. The reason I bring up these two passages is because whenever you get into ministry, or if you're already into ministry, there's at least two different facets. There are many others we could mention, but at least two that you need to be thinking about. You need to be thinking about your role with your specific expectations, job requirements, what you're trying to accomplish. Today, I need to do this. I need to visit these people. You see what I'm saying? I need to do A, B, C, and D. But you also need to be doing it with a global context in mind too. Realizing that what you're doing has a direct impact on the people around you, and that will eventually impact people at a global scale. Some of the things that I talked about with these stones of remembrances. The decision of planting a tree or cutting a tree has impacts. That's a very local decision, but it has very global consequences. A lot of times we just don't think of the world as something that is so small that you can actually have that kind of impact, but you actually can have that kind of an impact, and you do have that kind of an impact, whether you're acknowledging it or not. So what that means is, as you fulfill your role in a specific location, in a local congregation, wherever you may be, it actually is having an overall impact upon me and everyone else here. We have a very important role if we're getting into ministry that needs to be fulfilled. In the same way that Jesus was very particular about his ministry in Israel. Did you notice that? This was Jesus' ministry. Jesus' ministry was never in the rest of the world. His ministry was Palestine. And he was very serious about it. And he thought that what he needed to do was critical. And he weighed every local decision and did his best with them. But at the same time, everything that he did had a global impact, just massive ramifications, to the point that here we are 2,000 years later, and we're reading these texts and we're discussing it. That's the kind of impact he had, to where every decision he made, he prepared himself specifically for that context, realizing that the ramifications could be great and could be important. Now, I'm not trying to give us false expectations, and I'm not trying to make us view the world as if we think we're going to be as significant as Jesus. That's actually up for God to decide those types of things. We just do our responsibilities when we do our jobs. But the reason that I do mention this now, in conclusion, and then I think we'll have just a minute or two if anybody has any feedback or remarks you want to make. When I look back at all of the events that happened in my life, I never anticipated that I would have the privilege of responding to a situation in the Philippines to help plant a church in a suffering community back when I was taking that first semester class in college. When I was sitting there with Mark Cooper as my teacher, whose sole intention was to continue to mold students to be mission-minded, to go out into the world. I didn't have any idea that those things, or the things that came before in my childhood or with my family, how they would eventually play out to where I would end up being able to have a small role in events that impact the globe for Christ. And it was just an amazing experience to be able to see the continuity of how it all flowed together. What that means to you now, take the challenges you're given right now. Whatever they may be, however mundane they may appear to you, they're not mundane. They are critical. Don't take yourself too seriously, but please take yourself seriously at a basic level. Take your classes seriously. Take your free time seriously. It really does matter. In ways that you can't even fathom. Ways that you may never fathom how it matters. But it eventually does come to play, and God needs you to be that chess piece at the right place, at the right time, to do that amazing thing that God needed to do so that He will be glorified in some community in the world that otherwise will never call on His name. So think that way, view your life that way, and realize that you're being prepared for local ministry, and at the same time, you're in preparation for global ministry.